So, what I hope to show us today is that there's an interesting thread that runs throughout all of Mark chapter 8. And you may have picked up on it as you went through the lesson. Maybe you didn't, and that's just fine. But I want to show you that this entire chapter all fits together in, I think, kind of a neat way. And it was such an interesting... The way it tied together was so interesting to me that I thought, hey, this would make a really great sermon. But I can't preach it here because I'm about to divulge what it is. So, but anyways, I'll use it somewhere else. But Mark chapter 8 starts with another miracle. Mark has recorded miracle after miracle after miracle. And do you remember saying at the beginning of this class, 8-9 weeks ago, that Mark does not focus so much on the teachings of Jesus as much as he does the works and the miracles that Jesus performed. And we're finding that to be true, aren't we? We are reading about all of these miracles that Jesus has done, but very little of his teaching is given. We don't read these like the Sermon on the Mount. We don't read about these long discourses that he gave to the multitudes. We see his works instead. And we see at the beginning of Mark chapter 8, the feeding of the 4,000. Very similar story to the feeding of the 5,000, but not the same story. With the feeding of the 5,000, how many loaves of bread were there that Jesus multiplied to feed those 5,000 men? Yeah, 5. 5,000, 5 loaves. All right? When he fed the 4,000, how many loaves did he have this time? 7. All right? Wouldn't it be nice if it was 5,000, 5 loaves, 4,000, 4 loaves? But it's not. It's 4,000, 7 loaves. And Jesus takes those 7 loaves and he feeds this multitude of people. Verse 2 and 3 I think is interesting. I feel compassion for the people because they've remained with me now 3 days and have eaten nothing. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way. And some of them have come from a great distance. So once again, we see the humanity, the human side of Jesus. He feels compassion for these people. They have been so patient. They've been listening to him for 3 days. And Jesus says, we need to take care of these people before we send them home. So they have 7 loaves, and he takes those, verse 7, a few small fish, also like with the 5,000, 5 loaves and 2 fish. Here he has 7 loaves and a few fish. And he blessed them, and he tells the disciples to start distributing. This is just like they've done with the 5,000 people, and everyone is fed. And then in verse 10 it says they get in a boat and they leave, and they go to another area. Not really much to comment on from this miracle. It's, as we said, similar to the feeding of the 5,000. But remember where the chapter starts. It starts with Jesus multiplying loaves of bread. And we're going to come back to that in just a moment. Now, let's move on to the next section, verses 11 to 21, where Jesus warns his disciples about the leaven of the Pharisees. The Pharisees came out, verse 11, and began to argue with him. Imagine that, right? We've seen that a few times. And they were seeking from him a sign from heaven in order to test him. Sighing deeply in his spirit, he said, "Why does this generation seek for a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." Jesus is frustrated. He is sighing in his spirit, grieving in his spirit. He's not only frustrated, but he's also, I think, disappointed with these Pharisees. He has interacted with them numerous times, and he wishes things were going to be better, but he knows that he's never going to have good interactions with them. And so you can just kind of see his shoulders drooping, and he's disappointed. He wants things to go better with these Pharisees, but he's dealt with them long enough to know that they're not going to listen to him. And that even if he granted their request, show us a sign from heaven, even if he did something right there, that moment in front of their eyes, what would they do? Yeah, right. Yeah, he cast out demons by the ruler of Beelzebub, right? That's what they did. Jesus knows that. If he did something right there in front of them, they wouldn't believe it anyways. And knowing that, he just expresses that disappointment. He sighs deeply in his spirit. I like that expression. And he says, I'm not gonna give you a sign. He's given them plenty already, and they're not going to believe it anyways. So they leave the Pharisees, verse 13, and they go again to the other side of the sea. Now, they get into the boat and they're going to cross over to the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. And the disciples get on that boat with him, and they forgot to bring bread. They forgot something that was kind of important. They have one loaf of bread between them. So there's 13 people in the boat, there's one loaf of bread, and you don't have to do much math to know that that bread's not going to last very long. So they forget to bring bread, and they're on this boat with Jesus now. Verse 14, they'd forgotten to take bread, did not have more than one loaf in the boat with them. And he was giving orders to them, saying, now this is interesting. He doesn't, rebuke them for not bringing bread, but he uses this as a teaching opportunity. Watch out, he said, and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Now, they're talking about the fact that they don't have any bread to eat. There's one loaf for 13 people. And Jesus says, you need to watch out. You need to watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees and of Herod. Now, Jesus is obviously thinking back to this previous interaction that he's just had with the Pharisees. You need to watch out for them, he says. But what are the disciples worried about? What do they think he's talking about? We didn't bring any bread. Yeah, didn't they? Well, this is his way of kind of rebuking us for forgetting to bring bread. And they're worried about what they're going to eat.
Why would they do that with 5 loaves for 5,000 and 7 loaves for 4,000? They got one loaf, there's only
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, in fact, Jesus even says that. He says, didn't you learn anything from the feeding of the 5,000? If you drop down to verse 19, he said, when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you pick up? They said 12. When I broke the 7 for the 4,000, which we just read about, how many large baskets full of broken pieces did you pick up? And they said 7. And he was saying to them, do you not yet understand? When you're with me, physical bread is not the problem. That's not an issue. I can snap my finger and I can make physical bread. Do you remember Satan's first temptation? Command these stones to become bread. He could have done that. With just snapping his finger, he could have done that. Or, what was that TV show, Bewitched? Flicking his nose. He could have done that, all right? Come on. Is it early? I'm sorry. Lame attempted humor, I guess. But Jesus could have done that. The problem with him was never, or the problem for him was never physical bread. And he's trying to say to these disciples, why are you arguing about the fact that you only brought one piece of bread? I'm trying to point you to something more important. I'm trying to make a spiritual application of the fact that we just had this interaction with these Pharisees. You just brought one thing of bread, and I'm trying to use that to make a spiritual point, to make a teaching opportunity here. But they don't understand it. Look at verse 16. He says, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. They began to discuss with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, why do you discuss the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet see or understand? Do you have a hardened heart? The problem is not physical bread. The problem is that you need to watch out for the dangerous leaven of the Pharisees and of Herod. Now, look at question number 1 in your material, and we'll start, especially when we get to the next section, we're going to start tying this whole chapter together. In Matthew 16, 11 and 12, he specifically said, beware of the teaching of the Pharisees. All right? So besides just their teaching, which we've talked about some already in this class, what other things might Jesus be concerned would spread from the Pharisees and Herod to his disciples? Beware of the leaven, that spreading influence. A little bit goes a long way. Beware of that. All right, Randy, you had your hand up.
Well, it was so easy for me to see that the Gentiles got it when Jesus was on the earth. And when his apostles went, they were right there with him all the time, like here with this bread. They didn't get it. But Gentiles walked around him just from sayings. Knew that if he wanted something done, like we've already went over some of this stuff.
Yeah.
If you just say it's done, you don't even have to come here.
Yeah, the Syrophoenician woman last week. Yeah.
They got it.
Right.
Just from sayings.
Yeah.
But we got apostles that walk with him daily. They don't get it.
Right.
They don't get it.
Yeah, well, and hence Jesus' rebuke. You have eyes, you have ears, you're seeing, you're listening, and you're still not getting it.
Like we talked about that, we hadn't talked about it, but doubting Thomas.
Yeah.
He didn't get it.
Right. Okay, Sarah?
Sometimes it's easy to see the trees around you and not see the forest that spreads beyond because you're so wrapped up in the here and now. And they're with Jesus and they see these things. And it's easy to be like, well, we're Jews, we're chosen, and that influence of the Pharisees and the Herodians, it's easy for them to say, well, we've got these traditions and we do this right and we do that right. But they're missing the point of grace and mercy, and Jesus is here to save you. Like, he is the Messiah. And not necessarily you're wrapped up in the tradition, but you get lost in the history of your people, I guess.
Sure, absolutely. Okay, Clark?
I think sometimes, and I've had this discussion before, sometimes we are really pretty critical of the Jews. I mean, and rightfully so, but understand that there's been generation after generation after generation, they have been God's promised people.
1,500 years.
And they understood that. They knew that. They didn't always do it right, but they knew that was their privilege. That was their honor.
Right.
And yet all along they disobeyed. You know, one of the things about little leaven, when the children of Israel were intermarried, they would just sprinkle a little bit of doubt, They keep drifting further and further away. And they've just been their history.
Yeah, good. I think Mary Gail was first and then Mel. Did you have your hand up?
No, but we came up with attitude.
Okay, all right, good. Yeah, the attitudes of the Pharisees and of Herod. That's something Jesus didn't want spreading. All right, Mel?
You're going to say something about the 7 and the 12.
The 7 and the 12.
In other words...
No, I'm not. Enlighten me.
No, I mean, 7 is a whole thing.
Right.
And 12, many times, is also the same in a sense, but it's also noticed that we had 12 tribes and we got 12 apostles, and they're kind of magic numbers for
Okay, all right.
I'm thinking of Jesus. How many times have you gone into your boss and your boss goes, okay, and you're hanging your head, okay, he's angry. But Jesus did it so smoothly.
Right.
And then they still didn't do it.
Yeah. Yeah, my boss never snips at me that way. Okay, Matt.
One thing that you're asking that, what other things might Jesus be concerned with spread, the idea that they were clearly showing they were relying on something other than Jesus, God, directly. And when you think about the Pharisees, you think about Herod, whether they're relying on other authority, they're relying on traditions, they're relying on something else. But I think one of the things Jesus is saying, you can just rely on me, and they will get distracted.
Yeah, okay. Sandy?
Following up with what Matt said, kind of what I think a lot of the time is praying rote prayers. Maybe like, just not really praying to God, but...
Yeah, the showy, the self-aggrandizing prayers. Okay, so I think what we're all saying in if we could condense it down, watch out for the attitudes that the Pharisees had. Watch out for the ignorant stubbornness that the Pharisees had. And we've hinted at that in a number of ways. Watch out for the worldly, carnal attitudes of Herod and all of the people that follow after him and support him. Those influences will be harmful to you. And Jesus says you need to watch out for the leaven. Now, the leaven, of course, is something that is used in order to make bread. So you've got feeding 4,000 people with bread. Then you have the disciples with the one loaf of bread. Jesus talks about the leaven, which is used to make bread. And now we're going to go to the next section, and we're going to keep tying this theme together. Chapter 8, verses 22 to 26. Let's just read those verses. And they came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to Jesus and implored him to touch him. Taking the blind man by the hand, he brought him out of the village. And after spitting on his eyes and laying his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" Now, of course, when it says spitting in his eyes, not in a mean or hateful way, as we would, if somebody did that to us, that'd be... we'd probably slap them. I hope not, but we'd be tempted to at least. But, Jesus, that's obviously, this is not a malicious thing. But he does this, and he says, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and he said, verse 24, "I see men, for I see them like trees, walking around." Then again he laid his hands on his eyes, and he looked intently, and he was restored, and he began to see everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, do not even enter the village. He takes him out of the village in order to heal him, and he heals him in 2 stages. Now, thought question. Question number 2 in your material is, why does Jesus heal the man in 2 stages? Every other miracle that we've seen Jesus perform, it was instantaneous. When he gave sight back to the blind, he didn't do it in a gradual step process. He did it instantly. So why does he heal this man in 2 stages? Now, I know where I want to go with this question. And you may not have picked up on it, and that's fine. But I am curious to know if you came up with anything. And everybody's like, well, we don't know where he wants to go, so we're not going to say anything. All right, Trudy.
I looked at a few commentators because I thought it was an interesting question, and several of them said that they thought that Jesus was showing him heaven.
Showing him heaven?
He saw angels, or he was when he said, I see people walking around like trees. That he looked up.
Okay. That's interesting. I've not read that. You've read more widely than I have. Alan?
I sent you an article.
You did, yes, I saw that.
There's 2 things that were actually being done here. One was restoring the ability of the eye to see, and the second was for the brain to interpret what the eye is seeing. And that article explains, we know that medically now, they didn't know that then, and perhaps this is even more proof of Jesus' miraculous abilities for us now than it was there for those who actually saw it.
Okay, all right, interesting.
Maybe he was testing his faith, because that's the first time I remember him asking, do you see anything? Usually when he performed a miracle, he didn't ask him anything. They just...
Yeah, and Jesus doesn't ask him that out of curiosity. I don't know if it worked or not. Do you see anything? That's not the point of his question, right? Jesus knows what the man is able to see. All right, why did he heal the man in 2 stages? Here's what I'm going to say. Because that's what the disciples needed him to do. He's using this blind man to teach the disciples a lesson. Now, where is that coming from? All right, well, let me explain. Remember, I said this whole chapter all connects, all right? So we start with Jesus feeding the 4,000 people with bread. Then the disciples forget to bring bread on their trip. They've just got the 1 loaf. So then he uses that to warn them about leaven. Leaven, of course, is used to make bread. The disciples don't understand the point that he's trying to make about the leaven, so they start talking again about physical bread. Now Jesus reminds them, don't you remember when I miraculously fed the 5,000? I just fed the 4,000 in a miraculous way. But he rebukes them for their misunderstanding of the greater spiritual truth. Well, then they come to this blind man in Bethsaida. And I think Jesus uses this blind man, and knowing that he's going to heal him, he uses that as an illustration to teach the disciples a lesson, to show the disciples where they are spiritually. First, the man receives partial vision. I kind of in a blurred way, I see men. I know that they're people, and they're tall, they're standing up, they look like trees. They look like trees that are walking around. All right, surely this man, he has an idea of what trees are, even when he's blind. He can, people talked about the trees, and he knows what a tree is, at least in theory. So now he sees people standing up, they're walking around, and he says, wow. But his vision is not complete, it's just partial. So then Jesus comes back and he lays his hands on him a second time, and then he receives full, clear vision. Now, let's think about where the disciples are. The disciples at this point have a partial concept of who Jesus is, but their vision is not yet full. Here in Mark chapter 8, verse 29, we'll talk about this in a moment, but Jesus says, who do the crowd say that I am? Who do you say that I am? And Peter jumps up and he says, you're the Christ, you're the Son of God. They know that. They know that about Jesus. And yet, frequently, they didn't understand his teaching. They understood who he was, but they didn't always understand what he was saying. They didn't always understand the ramifications of what he was saying. For instance, Jesus talks about in verse 31 how he has to be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and be killed. And what does Peter do? No, we're not going to let that happen to you. You're the Son of God. We know that. But we don't really believe what you tell us. All right? Do you see how the disciples have blurred vision? They have first stage vision of who Jesus is.
So the longer they stay with him, the more their eyes will be open.
Exactly. And so as they continue with Jesus, what's going to happen with their vision? It's just going to get clearer and clearer and clearer. And just like this blind man, Jesus he wasn't limited by anything with this blind man. He didn't have to heal him in 2 stages. But I think he's saying to the disciples, you guys are like this blind man right now. I'm giving him partial vision. He can see some, but he can't see everything. And that's where you guys are right now. And so you need to stay with me. You need to keep working with me. Let me work with you, and your vision will only get clearer and clearer. And I think there's an application that we can make to ourselves in that. Let's not be content to be first stage Christians. But we need to be pressing on to that second stage where we're always seeing Jesus in a more clearer light. Where He's becoming more real and we understand Him in a deeper way. Let's move on to that second stage and not be content to stay at the first where we only have partial vision. Does that make sense? You with me? Some of you are like, yeah, I don't see that. They weren't totally blind at this point. But their vision wasn't totally clear either, because they oftentimes didn't understand things Jesus was telling them. And so they needed to be touched again. They needed to continue moving toward that greater vision. Donna?
First, let me say I like your explanation better, but I kind of looked at it as using control. Kind of like when He created the world, created the 6 stages. I like your explanation better. But then I thought, was He blind from birth? Because He knew what a tree was, He knew what human was like.
Right.
So was He blind from birth? Not that it matters, but...
Yeah, I hinted at this earlier that I assume that he had an idea of what a tree looked like because he's probably heard people describe them before. But he may have been born with sight and became blind. We don't know. All right. All right. So, Mel, he's going to argue with my point.
I read an article and I thought about this, about some people can see two-dimensional and they can't see three, not because they can't, it's because they won't. And this men walking around looking like a tree is a streaky two-dimensional, and he gave them three-dimensional, and the best of them, though, is to go to the fourth dimension, which is in the spirit.
Okay. All right. Good. All right. Anything else? Everybody's all confused now. All right. Let's talk about Peter. Yes, sir. I'm sorry?
He was blind from birth.
Does it say that?
It does in verse 9, in chapter 9, in John.
Well, are we sure that's the same person?
Well, that's what I'm asking.
Okay, well, the man in John 9 was definitely blind from his birth because the text says that. I don't know that this is the same person. It seems to be a different story.
In Mark, here it says that he was restored.
Uh-huh.
Restored would typically sort of indicate put back.
That's a good point. Yeah, good point. Yeah, good point. Okay, let's talk about Peter's confession. So he heals this blind man. He says, don't even enter the village. I'm not exactly sure why he tells the man that, but Jesus and the disciples then go to Caesarea Philippi. And while they're traveling, he questions the disciples and he says, who do all these people think that I am? You know, all these thousands and thousands of people that follow me from place to place, what are they saying? And they give some pretty interesting answers. In verse 28, some say you're John the Baptist, others Elijah, but others say you're one of the prophets. In Matthew's gospel, he specifically says some of the people think you're Jeremiah. And when you look at the people that are mentioned here that the populace thought Jesus was, John the Baptist, Jeremiah, they have things in common with Jesus. And you can almost see why people would have thought that that's who Jesus was, that he was one of those old prophets or someone else. But Jesus says, all right, you disciples, what do you think? What are your thoughts about who I am? In verse 29, Peter answered and said, you are the Christ, you are the Son of God. Peter was right. He had the truth, and he boldly professed it. Now, maybe it's easy to be bold when it's just you and Jesus and the other 11. But Peter, as he often does, he stands up and he says, I know this. This is the truth. This is what I think. And Jesus, he tells him not in Mark, in Matthew's gospel, Matthew 16, Jesus, he blesses him. Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for these things were revealed to you from heaven and not from men. So Jesus pronounces a blessing on him in Matthew. But then in verse 31 of Mark 8, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. After Peter stands up and says, you are the Messiah, the Son of God, do you think he was expecting Jesus to say what he said? That he's going to be killed, mistreated and killed. What would Peter be thinking? What would all the disciples be thinking? How do you kill God? You're the Son. We believe that you're deity. How are you going to die? That doesn't make any sense. How do you kill God? What else were you saying? You're going to restore the kingdom. Yeah. How can you die? If you die, our dreams of the kingdom being restored to Israel, they vanish. How can this be? So they're not accepting that. And I love verse 32. Jesus was stating the matter plainly. All right? He wasn't speaking in, metaphorical, figurative language that the disciples so often missed. The leaven of the Pharisees. They missed that. It was metaphorical. But he's speaking this plainly. Listen, I'm going to die. I'm going to be mistreated and killed. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Can you imagine that? Jesus, let me set you straight on something here. Probably thought too much of himself at that time, Clark.
This goes back to the point you were making. They just didn't understand.
Yes.
They needed that second level of comprehension.
Exactly.
And all the way through the scriptures, that's kind of the way it was.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, you kind of picture Peter putting his arm around Jesus' shoulder and say, walk with me, Jesus. Let's talk a little bit. And let me set you straight on this. You can't die. Yeah, right. Yeah. I heard what you said, Jesus, but let me tell you what I really think should happen. Okay? Look at the little box on the right side, the red box, arguing with Jesus. I hope you pondered on that a little bit. Do you ever argue with Jesus? Who doesn't? Yeah, I think that's true. At some point in our lives, we probably all argue with Jesus. He says something in the scriptures that we read and we just don't like it very much. And we wrestle with that and we struggle with that and we say, God, I wish it didn't say that. Thomas Jefferson just took his Sharpie knife and he just cut things out of the scripture because that's what he wanted to do. He didn't like it, he cut it out. But we can't do that. And we may wrestle with things, and Peter wrestled with what Jesus said. He argued with Jesus even. He didn't like what he said, but he also believed that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of God. And so he should have kept his mouth shut. And he shouldn't have argued with Jesus. And I don't need to argue with him either. I'm in no place to do that. But in verse 33, turning around and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and he said, "Get behind me, Satan." Now, why does he call him Satan?
Because of the world, yeah.
Okay. All right. Still has worldly influence there. What is Satan doing behind the scenes? Is he working alongside God, or is he working against him? He's working against him. So when Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan," he's saying, listen, what you're saying is of the devil. Because God's plan is that I be arrested and mistreated and killed and raised on the third day. If I don't do that, then I'm working Satan's plan. And if that's what you're wanting me to do, I mean, he's not literally saying Peter is Satan, obviously, but he's saying, listen, right now, what you're saying, your interests are aligned with the devil's interests. This is God's plan. This is what needs to happen. Don't work against me. Mel?
We know that Jesus he is God and he's omnipresent. And so all of this chapter 8 and this asking, who do men say that I am? And they start saying John the Baptist or Elijah and so-and-so. It's almost like you can see it's a prep for the transfiguration. When they see Moses and Elijah with Jesus, and the climactic part of that is, this is my son, hear him.
Right, good point.
And what I'm saying is, he knows what's happening in the future, and he knows the way they are, so he is preparing it. Because my mind is not God's mind. He's going to have to educate me because I've had all this other experience in life, and so fix me up.
Right. Yeah, and Mel gave us a good preview of where we're headed next week, and that ties it in together well. So we've already answered question number 3 in our discussing this. What was the point of Jesus? What point was Jesus making in his rebuke of Peter? That Jesus' death was the plan of God, and it was not just the plans of evil men. And Peter, of course, would not want the plans of evil men to succeed against his Lord and the Messiah, but Peter, it's not just the plans of evil men. This is God's plan. Don't set your mind on the interests of the world. All right, and then Jesus summons the crowd along with his disciples, and he says to them, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and for the gospel's sake will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father with his holy angels. Now, if your Bible has the words of Jesus in red, go ahead and tie in Mark chapter 9 and verse 1. You'll see that continues the same thought. It's kind of an unfortunate chapter break, even if your Bible doesn't put the words of Jesus in red, but you'll see it clearly if they are in red. Chapter 9 verse 1, I think, goes with this same discussion, and then chapter 9 and verse 2 takes us a different direction. But let's notice what Jesus says to this multitude after what he just told his disciples. He just told the disciples, I'm going to die. And then he turns to the multitude and he says, now who's coming with me? Right? Take up your cross. Come with me. You need to be willing to forfeit your own life and forfeit whatever worldly pursuits you may have. Because what would you give in exchange for your soul? Come with me. Come to the cross. Come with me. Let's get ready to die together. And you'll find true eternal life if you're willing to surrender this life. Okay. Any questions or comments about what we've talked about today? Yes, ma'am.
There have been Jews for many hundreds of years, and all the traditions, and some of them were prominent within the city, who came to follow Jesus, and to put out all of that you've been taught. And this little bit of short time they've been with Jesus. Look at him with human eyes. This is remarkable. You know, he's going to feed these people, and he did. So we've got to give them, a little humanity here.
Absolutely.
And how would I react?
That's a great point. And we've said that a few different times in the class. We look at the apostles and we say, how could they not understand? We look at the Pharisees and we say, how could they be so obtuse? Well, there's 1,500 years of Jewish history here. I mean, Moses received the 10 Commandments about 1450 BC. And here we are at AD 27 to 30. So we're almost 1,500 years of Jewish history later. And all of these stories and traditions have been passed down from generation to generation. And now here comes this Jesus guy, and he's telling us that 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4. It equals 7. And they're having a hard time wrapping their mind around that. Okay? So, let's not be too hard on them. It's easy for us to look back and say, well, if I'd been living back then, I wouldn't have done that. You know what? That's exactly what the Pharisees said. In Matthew 23, Jesus said, don't look back and say, well, if we had been around with our fathers, we wouldn't have killed the prophets. Yeah, you would have. And we probably would have gone with the multitude more often than we would like to think. All right, good points. Thank you very much, and we will look to Mark chapter 9 next week, Lord willing.